Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hey guys, before I start today's episode for the Mystery of the 99 Steps, I thought I would let you all in on something really cool. Now, if you follow me on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, this is a little bit of old news, but I have launched a website. It is www.truedrewpodcast.com, and on this website, I am actually selling the Nancy Drew books. So if you're looking for the books before the podcast episodes air, and you just want to read them before the episode comes out, or if you're just looking to complete your Nancy Drew book collection, you should definitely check out that website. I also plan on having some Nancy Drew merchandise in the future for True Drew Podcast and Nancy Drew game related merch. So just wanted to throw that out and let you guys know. Now, on to the episode. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. It's also the first week of September, so that's really cool. I am a little bit biased because September is my birth month. And yes, you heard me correctly, birth month, not birthday. I'm taking a note out of my mom's playbook because as a kid, I remember her saying, June is my birth month, like the whole entire month. And she was so extra about it, so yeah. I feel like you should do that every now and then, like, treat yourself. All birthday stuff aside, though, I really do like this time of year because we're moving into fall and it's right before Halloween and it's just the perfect time to curl up with a good mystery. And we've got a great mystery to talk about today, and it is the mystery of the 99 Steps. So this book stood out to me a lot as a kid. I thought the cover was really cool. I was like, dang, that's a lot of steps. But I also liked what Nancy and George were wearing. It just was kind of an interesting cover, but I didn't remember anything about the plot other than the fact that it takes place in France. So the mystery of the 99 Steps is book number 43 in the series, and it was first published in 1966. Also, wow, we've covered 43 books for this podcast, which is mind-blowing. So I always like to start these episodes off by talking about the book covers, and there was only one that I was able to find for this book, but I always post these covers on my Instagram on Wednesdays, and my Instagram is True Drew Podcast. So on this cover, we have Nancy and George at the base of a huge staircase, which has, spoiler alert, 99 steps. And George is wearing this turquoise dress and her hair is dark and shorter. And we have Nancy with the blonde flipped out hair. And she's wearing an orange dress with the cutest little collar. Like, I would wear this dress in a heartbeat. I've actually come across dresses like this when thrifting, like vintage stuff from the 60s and 70s. And I want to recreate some of these book covers. It would be so cool. So at the top of this long flight of stairs, there's a shadowy figure. And as a kid, I always thought that was kind of scary. I was like, oh no, somebody's following Nancy and George. But if you read the book, it's actually Bess. Bess was standing at the top of the stairs to kind of watch and make sure that nobody snuck up on them. So I came up with a couple of funny cover spoofs, and the first one is wee all the way down the stairs because it's in France. And the second cover spoof that I came up with is Le Cardio, because I don't know about you, but that's a lot of stairs. So I gave this book cover a 4 magnifying glasses rating because honestly, Nancy and George's outfits are fire. And I don't know, just something about that long staircase always intrigued me as a kid. So now we'll go ahead and discuss the characters in this book, and be forewarned, there's some French names and I'm probably going to mispronounce them. So there is Marie and Monique Bardot, and you cannot tell me that's not a take on Bridget Bardot because she was such a huge movie star at the time that this came out in the 60s. There's also Josette Blair, who is their aunt, Charles LeBlanc, James Chase, who is the helicopter guy. More on that in a second. Claude and Louis Aubert, Abdul Ramos, and if I were really going to play up the American accent, I would say Henry Durant, but I'm pretty sure it's Henri Durant. See, I can stretch out my A's and my vowels, or I can try at least. So now we'll go ahead and jump into the synopsis for The Mystery of the 99 Steps. Nancy is excited to work on a case for Josette Blair, who has a recurring dream about 99 steps from her childhood, while Carson, meanwhile, has a case concerning a financier, Charles LeBlanc, who keeps selling all his assets. The girls and Carson receive threats before leaving River Heights for Paris, France, but the threats continue overseas. They are followed, brakes are pulled from their car, and many other disasters befall them. Alchemy plays heavily into this mystery, and Nancy is finally able to find the 99 steps, find a lab, and figure out why LeBlanc is selling all that he owns. So the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with to sum it all up is American teen solves scam against French financier. So I wrote down a lot of notes for this one. Let's go ahead and discuss. So our mystery starts with Nancy inviting Bess and George to France. And I just said, man, I wish I had a friend like that would just call me up and be like, hey, do you want to go to Paris? I mean, granted, it would probably be like with the addendum of like, you might die. There might be a villain that's after us, but you want to go eat croissants? Like, part of that might give me pause, but the rest of it, I'd be like, yeah, sure. Another cool thing is that in the beginning of this book, we get another time reference to what time of year it is. And it says it's an unseasonably cool day in June, and the Drews have a fire going. It must be really cold. My next note just says the Bardot sisters, definitely referencing Brigitte Bardot. I mean, she's a famous French actress, and there's no coincidence. You can't tell me that that's a coincidence that they use that last name. So the next thing that I have down is Josette Blair, who is their aunt, lost her husband and her son to a car accident, and I thought that was really, really sad. But like most of the Nancy Drew books, they just throw it in there like, by the way, they died in a horrific way, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm just supposed to process this and then move on in the next page, but okay. So the next thing I wrote down is the mystery of the insomnia. So Miss Blair keeps dreaming about 99 steps, and she wants Nancy to help find them in France, and Carson is already over there on another case. And Miss Blair also got a weird note that said, don't tell anyone about the 99 steps. Obviously, she took that warning really seriously, but it's signed from Bonjour 9, or Mr. 9. So the numbers 9 and 99, they play into this story very heavily. So remember that fire that's going in the fireplace on this unseasonably cool June day? Well, it plays into the story because Nancy, Bess, and George are talking in the living room about this case when a helicopter flies low over the house and causes ash to shoot out of the fireplace. I don't know what about Nancy's house says fly really low over me, but it feels like in so many of the books there's planes and helicopters that do this. But there's ashes flying all around the living room, and George and Bess have to like pat Nancy's hair and her clothes down because she almost catches on fire. So it's after this happens that the Bardot sisters come over for dinner, and then this man with a half mask and a limp comes to the door with a note telling Nancy to stay out of France. Something tells me she's going to ignore that completely. Also, it says it's a half mask. Is it like half over the top of his face, the top half of his face, or is it just half of his face like the Phantom of the Opera? Inquiring minds need to know. So I thought this was kind of funny, but Carson has actually named his case. He calls it the case of the frightened financier. It sounds pretty catchy, actually. But Nancy starts talking about her dad's case when she drives Bess and George home, and Bess says, Frenchman. I'm not going to say a word. But anyway, apparently Carson is world-renowned. Like, he's been hired because the people obtaining his services think an American lawyer will be less suspicious than a French one. And I just said, okay, like, that's not going to make him stick out even more? I don't know. I mean, hey, never look a gift trip to France in the mouth. So Nancy drops Bess and George off at their houses, and it's while she's driving back home that the masked man appears again. He tries to jump in front of her car and claims that he's hurt, and Nancy just backs up and speeds off because she feels like he's going to hurt her if she gets out of the car. I have to say, bravo, Nancy, because this was very common sense. Like, you just don't do that, especially when it looks like someone is purposefully trying to jump in front of your car and act like you hurt them. And so Nancy calls the police, though, because she's like, well, maybe he was hurt, and she starts to feel bad, but they find no trace of the guy. He's went off somewhere. Suspicious. So the next note that I took down is Nancy investigates the low-flying helicopter that went over her house. And the pilot says the guy had lied about putting a helicopter pad on the Drew's roof. And he also describes the guy as a, quote, queer-looking duck about 55 years old with a real long face, arms, and feet. So queer in this context just means strange, but I was like, who notices how long someone's arms and legs and feet are? Like, that's so Weird. But Nancy does get a guy's name, and he says the man gave the name of James Chase. And Marie and Monique perk up at this, and they say he sounds like a gardener a friend of theirs had named Claude, who was fired for stealing money. And Chief McGinnis helps them wire France and gets the man's last name, and it's Aubert. So now we've got a name for this masked individual, and he can't hide as easily. The next note that I have down is Bess is apparently in something called a Teeners Club for teenagers, and they apparently entertain this other group called the Towners. So it's like a teen group that's entertaining the elderly. And I was like, that's pretty cool, actually. But she and Nancy convinced the Bardot sisters to sing for them because they apparently have lovely voices, and everybody's like really excited about that. I think Nancy was just secretly excited that she didn't have to sing for this group because Bess was trying to get her to perform for them, and Nancy just hates the spotlight. So she was like, how about the Bardot sisters? So it's while the Bardot sisters are performing for the Towners Club that Nancy goes to see the girl's Aunt Josette, who has her mother's diary, and they look in it for clues about the 99 steps. And Josette said she had a governess and lived in many chateaus, so Nancy says she'll search them for the 99 steps once she gets to France. Miss Blair specifically mentions a chateau called Loire, I believe that's how you say it, which was supposedly haunted by an alchemist. And alchemy makes me think of Curse of Blackmore Manor, which is, it's such a good game. Anyway, we get a little lesson, and she says that Red King stands for gold, White Queen for silver, and Green Lion stands for acid or corrosion. This will come back into play a little bit later. So Nancy thanks Miss Blair for talking to her, and then she goes to see the Bardot sisters performing, and she spots Claude Aubert in the audience, the man who was wearing the mask. So he threatens the girls, saying they'd better not let Nancy go to France, and he gets away, but later tries to break in Nancy's house. So it's kind of funny because Nancy is having this weird dream about people in the 1700s, and they're wearing all these fancy clothes, and they're running out of a chateau, and there's these ringing bells, and she's chasing Claude Aubert in her dream. Well, then she wakes up and she realizes the bells are actually the burglar alarm going off, and so Nancy and the girls go downstairs, and they don't find an intruder or footprints, but Nancy does find what looks like stilt impressions in the ground. So you mean to tell me that this person just hobbled up to the Drew's house on stilts and then hobbled away on stilts? Like, I don't picture someone getting away very fast on those, but it is a very clever way to disguise any footprints you would leave. But what's hilarious about this is Chief McGinnis says he'll do some digging to see if there's any known criminals who use stilts. And I was like, I'm sorry, what? I know most villains have a calling card, but come on, I'd love to be there for that conversation. Do you use stilts? No, sir. My preferred method of breaking and entering is blunt force and wearing scuba apparatus. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I was trying to read that, like, I had like Elijah Wood's voice in my head when he's in that interview, and it's like, do you wear wigs? Do you wear stilts? So Nancy and Hannah find a sign on Nancy's car after they've looked around for footprints, and it says, beware the green lion. So we have that connection with possibly an alchemist as the villain. So finally, Nancy, Bess, and George get to France with little to no incidents, and George says she wants to go to Notre Dame to see the ugly gargoyles, and it says Nancy is going up this narrow staircase when a large woman shoves past her and knocks her down the stairs. So this causes a chain reaction, and Nancy hits Bess, and Bess hits George, and they all fall, and somehow Carson is able to keep them from rolling down all the steps, but ouch. So after they make sure that everyone's okay, they make it up to the observation deck up on the roof, and Nancy notices a man from several stories up, I might add, that looks like Claude Aubert, and thinks he may have a twin. So his name later turns out to be Louis, and Louis spies on them in a garden, and they chase him but lose him. And he actually is Claude's twin. The next thing that I wrote down is the girls and Carson locate Aubert's old apartment, and Nancy counts the steps, and there are 99. So she also learns from someone that he is a chemist, and they learn that Claude forged a check in Charles LeBlanc's name, so that's a connection between Nancy and Carson's cases. So after they do this, they go to a party at Bonjour and Madame Tremaine's house, and someone purposefully crashes their car into the taxi that everyone is in. So Nancy, Bess, Bess, George, and Carson are just sitting in this taxi, and someone just rams them and then pulls away. We've fallen downstairs, we've been hit in a car that's just sitting on the side of the road, and we've gotten a lot of threats, so this mystery is shaping up to be a real good one. So this next bit is kind of problematic, but Nancy and George become suspicious of an Arabian man, and Nancy just keeps referring to him as the Arab. But Nancy catches him staring at her while dancing with someone named Henri Durant, and apparently it turns out to be a disguise, and it's Louis Aubert. So he's not even Arabian, but I'm like, why are you masquerading as someone that's a different nationality? I'm just like, make it stop. So, of course, he gets away again, and the next day, Carson is reading a paper, and they see that Monsieur LeBlanc was robbed on his way home, and he had thousands of dollars on him. I'm sorry, but why are you carrying that much money on you? I mean, I know times have changed, but still, like, it's just not a smart move. Aw, this next note is really sweet. I forgot about this, but Nancy buys Hannah a musical teapot. I thought that was really cute. I want to know what song it's playing. Be our guest, be our guest. Probably not. So the next thing that I wrote down is everyone tails Monsieur LeBlanc, but he gets away. So they go eat dinner, and it says Bess despairs about snails and fish with their eyes still attached. Now, I will say I have tried escargot. It was as a dare on a cruise ship, like 15 plus years ago, but I did not chew it. I swallowed it whole, so I don't know if that really counts. But it is kind of interesting. My grandfather ordered fish one time, like a seafood platter. He thought, oh, that sounds really good, while we were in Venice, Italy. And it did come with the head still attached and the eyes and all the bones still in it. It was like, it's just a cultural difference, but I don't know. I don't think I can get behind something staring up at me from a plate. It's not for me. I think I'm on Bess's side with this one. Also, you probably knew this was coming because there's food involved, but I said we're in another country, but that does not stop George from fat shaming Bess. So Bess says what she wants to order, which is a reasonable amount of food, and George says, you'll be bursting out of your clothes within 3 days if you eat like that. Okay, I think everybody needs to take a vote on this trip and say, for all those in favor of leaving George in France, say aye. We ain't gonna miss ya. So Nancy, Bess, George, and Carson go to do a stakeout at LeBlanc's chateau, and Bess gets scared of a dummy that's hanging from a tree in the woods, which, that is kind of spooky. I don't think I'd like that. But they get chased away by a dog, and I was like, they are trespassing. It's another country. There's different jurisdictions and laws, but pretty sure trespassing is one of those, like, universal things. You just don't do that. But yeah, the dogs chase them right up to the fence, and they're barely able to get over it in time. So this next note is breaking news. Nancy gets news from River Heights. The stilt walker was arrested. And so he was apparently hired by the Auberts, and Miss Blair had another dream about the 99 steps. And this time she remembered the name of her governess as a kid. Lucille Magnon. How am I doing? Am I doing okay? Like, I know I have some people that listen to this podcast from France. I'm trying my best. I hope I'm doing okay. But speaking of, it's so cool to look at the analytics. I've got people from like Canada and South America, and all these different countries that listen to the podcast. So I just wanted to say hi. Love you guys. So anyways, back to my notes. Apparently the Bardot's chateau is out past Versailles, and they have a black poodle named Fifi. And I said, that's the most poodle sounding name ever. And she sleeps in an 18th century dog bed. Like, as a full-time pet sitter, I could appreciate that. I was like, wow, the opulence. That is so cool. So the girls are out there visiting with Marie and Monique's parents, and it turns out they do speak some French, and they encourage the girls to speak French so they're a little less conspicuous. Pretty good advice. But the Bardots actually give them another tip and say they should investigate Versailles because there's quite a few steps there, and so Nancy thinks, well, maybe there's 99 steps. So they go to Versailles, and sure enough, on the 99th step, out in the garden area, they find M9 written in black chalk. Mr. 9 strikes again. So it's while they're examining this that George sees a door of the palace open, and she thinks someone is spying on them. So she checks it out, and she literally gets a cane around the neck, and she's pulled into the palace like a vaudeville performer getting pulled off of a stage. Like, oh my gosh, that would hurt so bad. So Nancy and Bess run to get a guard, and he thinks they're lying to him, but Nancy finds a button off of George's shirt, and she shows it to him, and she's like, no, this came off my friend's shirt. So they walk around the palace looking for George, and they eventually find her, and she's passed out in Louis XIV's bed. So George laughs and says, "Imagine me sleeping in Louis XIV's bed." And I just wrote down, "George, you're not the first, trust me. He had some mistresses." But George does find a note in her pocket that says, "You girls mind your own business or grave consequences will come to you. The Red King." Dun dun dun. So the next note that I have is the girls follow a lead to the DuPonts, and they say a woman claiming to be Josette Blair's governess came by years ago, and she was married to Louis Aubert. Yet another connection. So a maid named Estelle says Louis was a teacher of hers too, which sounds a little bit odd. Like, how does this guy have time to teach and also commit so many crimes? So it also wouldn't be a Nancy Drew book without Nancy saving some young kid. So she saves this kid who falls off of a statue of Joan of Arc at a parade. And it's right after this that Henri Durant just shows up again. So he and Nancy go sightseeing in a boat, bad idea, and then a man at the dock says Henri has a telephone call. And while he's gone, Nancy gets attacked by a bearded man who says, "You are trying to solve a dream. Well, I will give you something to dream about." Then he slaps her so hard she falls out of the canoe, and Henri dives in to save her. Like, I've always wanted to go to France, but not if stuff like this happens. Thankfully, I'm not Nancy Drew. So the next thing that I wrote down is there are two Louis Auberts. There's a thief and there's a school teacher. So it turns out it wasn't the same person. This guy has been using that name, or they both happen to have the same name, but he got the bad Louis Aubert's mail. The teacher did. So yeah, Nancy's able to look through that. So according to this book, Bess Marvin is not good at math. She just says that she's not, and I felt that because I don't like math either. It's not my favorite subject. So remember the Bardot's poodle, Fifi? She gets poisoned and then their house is robbed. So all their gold gets stolen, and Nancy starts to speculate that maybe an alchemist did it. There's been a lot of alchemy hints throughout this book and a lot of clues pointing to that, so it makes sense. Next, we have our second car accident in the book, and Nancy, Bess, and George are going to Loire Valley, and the brakes just go out and they start rolling downhill, and so somebody tampered with the car, presumably the same person that robbed the Bardot's house. But the girls are able to borrow another car, and they go and explore a ruin, and someone is in a suit of armor with a sword, and they yell at them to stop or he'll run them through. This freaked me out, but it turns out to be this little kid named Pierre who tells them about another ruin that they might want to explore. So this time they find the 99 steps at the second ruin, and at the very bottom of that staircase they see a lab, and inside that lab is Louis Aubert, again wearing the Arabian disguise for some reason, and he's putting gold into coal. So as I explained at the beginning of this episode, Bess was watching from the top of the steps, so Nancy and George are able to hide. She alerts them in time, and then LeBlanc shows up, and Aubert has him convinced that he can turn anything into gold, and that's why he's been giving his money away. Like, I really had so little patience for this LeBlanc guy. I mean, he had $1,000 on him, he got it stolen. He's convinced that this guy can make gold out of coal. Like, how dumb are you? So the next thing that I wrote down in my notes is Carson jokes he's going to give Nancy half his fee, and she says, "Only half?" That's right, Nancy, you tell him. I've been saying it from day one. Ask what you're worth. Okay, so my next note just says Louis Aubert is Abdul Ramos. Great. Like, I don't like when the Nancy Drew books have somebody going by one name for the majority of the story, and then at the end they're like, actually, his name is this. Like, I don't know. I don't like a bait and switch like that. But anyways, he knows they're spying on him, and he locks them in the lab after throwing a sack in the fireplace of, I don't know, explosive stuff. He just says, "Take that," and he throws it in the fireplace and leaves. But they get out before it catches on fire. They're able to pull it out of the fireplace. But they meet Aubert's wife, who was Josette's governess, and apparently she took Josette down the 99 steps, and it's where her and Louis had to secretly rendezvous. Yuck. Like, one, you're a governess. You're supposed to be watching this child not making out with this strange man. And then two, if you have to hide this romance, like, is it really worth it? Like, is he that good of a guy? Apparently he's not. He's a villain. Now we know this. But I was just like, okay, like, you're on the clock. Quit making out with this guy at the bottom of these steps with, And like, you obviously gave this child nightmares because she had dreams about this years later. I don't know. It's messed up. Something tells me she fixated on the 99 steps because she didn't want to see what you guys were doing. Anyways, for the What's Cooking section of this podcast, Hannah did a little bit of cooking, and then we got to see some good French food in this book. So Hannah made lemon meringue pie before Nancy left the States. Nancy got to sample some French pastry and hot chocolate. There was cheese souffle, and there was fish stew and plum tarts. And for the things that I said that Nancy could add to her resume, I said she's Hawkeye Drew because she spotted Louis Aubert from the top of the Notre Dame. And she's also a French linguist. She apparently knows enough French to get by in a simple conversation. So now we'll discuss the things that I liked and the things that I didn't like about the Mystery of the 99 Steps. So I liked the fact that this book was set in France. I've always wanted to go to France, so that was really cool for me. And I thought that the aspect of a dream mystery was kind of cool. We haven't really seen that up to this point. And as for the things I didn't like, I feel like at a certain point this book did sort of start to drag. And I didn't like the fact that Nancy referred to this man as the Arab. She just would call him the Arab. And I was like, that's really offensive. And I didn't like the fact that Josette Blair's governess just took her with her to meet this strange man. I was like, that's so weird. So I gave the Mystery of the 99 Steps a magnifying glass rating of 2 magnifying glasses. There's other books set in France later down in the series, and I think they're so much better than this one. But I did like it to an extent. Like, parts of it were pretty good, but it's just not my favorite book. So for next week's episode, we're going to be talking about the clue in the crossword cipher. So if you like the Nazcan lines and Peru, you're really going to like this one. Until next time, thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at truedrewpodcast.